After that, the daily torture changed. First, he would tackle her, pin her wrists to the ground, and sit on her chest. Then he'd summon up a frothy mouthful of spit in his cheeks and just let it ooze out between his lips, slowly extending it farther and farther down without letting go of it. And then, when the head of the strand dangled a half-inch above her cheek and Maggie was wincing, burying her head into the ground trying to wiggle away from it, he would slurp it back up like a yo-yo, chew on it some more, swish it around in his cheeks, and repeat. Back and forth, closer and closer, until he could no longer abstain from the pleasure of seeing it slopped on her face. Maggie began to carry a hand towel in her backpack to clean herself up with before he let her walk home, so her mother wouldn't see her like this when she got home from school. Much later, in high school, Maggie fell in love with Caleb. They moved in together, much happened, and a year later she left him. A year after that, Maggie married Kelly Callahan, and soon after she gave birth to their son, Gabriel. One night, when Kelly was at work, Caleb Quinn came over. Johanna was 84 years old and still lived in the tall, narrow house her late husband had built when they married and moved to Colorado 60 years earlier. He was a good builder, but an amateur designer, and his do-it-yourself approach resulted in some strange architectural quirks. The double doors at the end of the second-story hallway opened onto a 20-foot drop where he'd intended to build an upper deck. The second floor was accessible not by a staircase, but by a pneumatic, pedal-operated wrought iron elevator, which is why Johanna kept a rope ladder upstairs, in case it ever broke and she got stuck up there. The ghosts of her late husband's hands were all over everything. Most of the people Johanna had known well in her life were dead. Johanna was having problems with language. Words were leaving her. Simple verbs and nouns mysteriously vanishing from her vocabulary. They were moving out of her brain and leaving their empty shapes behind, like the pale outlines of pieces of furniture that have been sold or given away. She occasionally found herself wondering how to communicate actions like listen, eat, give, or grasping to recall the words for objects like tables, spoons, or garbage cans, as if these things were so unremarkable that people had never bothered to waste time thinking of names for them. She was losing information. It was as if her brain was a wall from which every day someone was carefully removing a few bricks, slowly weakening the integrity of the structure. She was alone in her house, situated at the intersection of two unpaved county roads, by a lake, a power plant, a line of railroad tracks, and an empty field of brown grass. An aluminum Christmas tree stood in the living room year-round. A few years before he died, her husband had bought a telescope, which he had set up on a tripod inside the glass doors to nowhere at the end of the second-story hallway. Her phone rang routinely once a week on Sunday afternoons when her son called from Houston. The call usually came at about 3 o'clock, sometimes up to 15 minutes past or 15 minutes before the hour. She would wait until the middle of the third or fourth ring to answer it and say, "Hello?" And she would be answered by the disembodied voice of her son in the receiver, tunneling through wires or quivering along a system of strings or tubes or however it got from there to here, and she'd have a conversation with it. Her son, who lived in Houston, would usually visit twice a year. She still drove herself to the grocery store in town and cooked her own meals. There was also an oak grandfather clock with a brass pendulum, and it still kept time. Johanna's hearing was still good enough to predict when the clock would strike, from anywhere in the house, by the subtle ratcheting noise it made when it reared itself to bong out the count of the hour. There was a lot of silence in the house. She read the Bible. One day, reading the book of Ezekiel, she began to think about the following passage. "I looked, and I saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning and surrounded by..."